My name is Joshua, and I live in Arkansas. And in late 2003, right before it started getting cold, my wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugarloaf Lake in Oklahoma so we could check out some paranormal places in the area. It was dark when we got there, and we all climbed into Bob's car. We drove around for a few hours, checking out abandoned houses and graveyards, but around midnight we started to get bored. Bob smiled and said he was saving the best for last, and he turned down an old dirt road with the woods on one side and a barbed wire fence on the other. There were 2 acres of field connecting the wooded hillside, but nothing to light the night except the full moon and the clear starry sky. He stopped the car and we got out and looked toward the fence and the field and the wooded hillside. He looked at his cell phone and he told us that it was 11:57, and he told us to watch and wait. At exactly midnight, a small light flickered in the middle of the hillside, and a chill ran down my back as we watched the small lantern-like light begin to move, swaying back and forth. We watched in complete silence for several minutes when I finally spoke up and asked what it was. Bob said he didn't know, but locals had told him that at midnight on every night, this lantern would light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun came up, and then it would disappear, and there were no lights or houses on the hillside, so it didn't make any sense. At the time, I was a 19-year-old kid who didn't think anything would scare me or hurt me, so I had the bright idea to yell at it. "Yeah, we see you. Wow, you're so scary with your little lantern," I shouted, and I started laughing. Bob told me to shut up, but it was too late. My wife screamed and pointed, and I saw the lantern moving down the hillside, gliding at an unhuman pace, speeding across the field toward the car. Within seconds, we were buckled up and flying down the dirt road back to the lake, and when we looked back, we saw the lantern moving slowly back up the hillside to where it first appeared. The ride back was silent, and when we got back to Sugarloaf Lake, we dropped my tailgate, and we sat around and talked about what had just happened. A little while later, Bob asked if we could take the truck to the next town to get some food because his car wouldn't have enough gas to get us there. I said okay, and I put the tailgate up and we loaded into my truck. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. My truck was dead. There was no ding, no lights, no clicking noise, nothing. We got out of the truck and popped the hood, pulled Bob's car around to the front and attempted to jump-start it with his car. And as soon as we connected the jumper cables to his battery and mine, the connector started to smoke. And then, in an inexplicable flash of fire, they burned up into bits and melted rubber and ash with only the end clamps left, still attached to the batteries. Bob and I looked at each other in an eerie moon and starlit night, confused as all hell, and realized there was a distant noise on the lake that was getting closer to us. It was a boat motor. At this time of year, it was starting to get cold, especially at night. And somebody being out in a boat at that time of the night, at that time of the year, didn't make sense. When the boat was just about 50 yards away, a spotlight turned on and blinded us all. Bob and I told the girls to get in the car, locked the doors, and I reached into the bed of my truck and grabbed a tire tool. The boat pulled up to the dock, and 2 heavily bearded men stepped out and walked up to us with the spotlight still on. They looked at our vehicles and then the women in the car, and they laughed. "You fellers got some sort of car trouble?" one asked as he lit up a cigarette. "Yeah, it's nothing we can't handle," I stammered. The guy with the cigarette sniffed the air and looked down at our feet and saw the smoking ashes of the jumper cable. "Looks like it was more than your weak jumper cables could handle. We got some tools on the boat. Fix your problems right up." "Yeah, fix 'em right up," the other guy said. They walked back to the boat, and we heard what sounded like chains rattling around, and we tried to make out what they were doing, but the spotlight was so blinding that we could barely see. But that chain noise, something about it wasn't right. Something about those men wasn't right. Bob and I exchanged a glance, and without saying a word, we jumped in his car and we drove the hell out of there. We got to a populated area of houses nearby, and we sat in the car quietly and looked around the whole time, thinking that at any time those weird men would come and find us. And every now and then, Bob would turn his lights on, thinking he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while, the women fell asleep, and Bob and I talked about how weird this whole ordeal had been. The men never showed up, and eventually the morning was on its way. It was about 20 minutes until daylight, and Bob asked if I wanted to see the lantern really disappear at sunrise like the locals said. He was sure he had enough fuel, so we headed out there. About 4 minutes left until sunrise, we saw the lantern swaying in the woods. We all stared at it in wonder. When the sun rose, we watched the lantern slowly fade away to nothing. We got back in the car and drove back to the lake feeling safer now. There was no sign of the boat, the hood of my truck was still up, and those doors were still locked. I got in the cab and tried to start the truck one more time, and I'll be damned if it didn't start right up. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise and counting our blessings and swearing to leave the paranormal investigation in that area to others. But all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years, called me up and said he had a proposition for me. Bob was a Wiccan. He had a small group of 3 other Wiccans, and they did seances in haunted places sometimes, and Bob asked me if I'd be willing to film their sessions. Well, I'm no Wiccan, but he offered to pay me well. I told him I'd be happy to film for them, but I had no interest in joining in. The first place they wanted to go was Sugarloaf, and he asked me if I remembered the lantern light that we had seen out there, and I asked him how I could have ever forgotten that. Bob wanted to contact the lantern spirit and find out why it was there and what it wanted. I felt uncomfortable about this whole thing, but Bob had offered to pay me, so I agreed to it. A week later, I was in Bob's car with 2 other guys and a girl I had never met, going down that dirt road to the haunted hillside. We got there at 11:50 p.m. The 4 of them sat in a tight circle. I was behind them, 5 feet from the fence and my back to the hillside. They started chanting, and I started filming. Words cannot do justice to the pure terror that ensued. Whatever light interest I had in the paranormal before that night was gone, and after what happened, I wanted nothing to do with it ever again. As the group chanted, Bob lit up a huge candle in the middle of them and opened up some sort of book. He started reciting words from it. He looked at his phone and told his group to be quiet and look at the hill. I turned the camera around, and at midnight, on the dot, the lantern appeared. Bob's group joined hands and attempted to communicate with the spirit. I turned my back to the light and turned the camera back to the group and filmed them as they started asking questions of the spirit, hoping for a response. About this time, a strong wind picked up and Bob's candle went out. He told me to cut the camera for a minute as he went on to try to get his lighter working to no avail. The others in the group tried their lighters, but none of them worked either. I was sitting down at that point, watching them try to get a flame started, when I heard a rustling behind me, and I jumped up and left the camera on the ground and spun around. Right away, I was blinded by a spotlight. It was a lantern close up and personal, but as soon as it appeared, it was gone, and I didn't have a chance to identify it. I looked around for the lantern on the hillside, but I didn't see anything. And right then, the wind quit blowing, and I heard Bob's lighter finally work. I asked if any of the others had seen the light, and before any of them could speak, we heard a distant laughter coming from nowhere and everywhere around us. It was no ordinary laughter. It was like the laughter of hundreds, even thousands of children. It was a sinister laughing. It was a goofy laughing and giggling all around us, coming from all directions. I started shaking. I couldn't move. I was spinning around, looking everywhere for some kind of an explanation, because something like that doesn't happen in real life. And then I screamed at Bob that we needed to get the hell out of there. And the laughter was getting closer and louder, and we hauled out of there, leaving the candle and the camera behind. A mile up the road, Bob pulled over. He was in no condition to drive. So we all got out of the car and paced around the road and tried to make sense of what we had just seen. I got my hands on my knees and I was panting and trying to catch my breath when we heard laughter off in the distance again. At first it was quiet, but it slowly got closer and louder until once again it was deafening. And we jumped back in the car and we sped away. We drove 5 or 6 miles. For the first 3, we heard the laughter in the distance following us. And when it faded, we started calming down, and Bob's friend in the passenger seat had his phone out waiting for a signal to pop up, and as soon as it did, he called a friend of his who was a well-versed and educated man in all things of the occult. She was on the speaker and told Bob and his friend that she believed that this was the children of Hecate. And we were still speeding down the road when the hair on the back of all of our necks stood up straight. Then there was a loud snapping noise from in front of Bob's hood, and Bob's truck stopped dead in its tracks and wouldn't go another inch. The friend on the phone only lived about 20 minutes away from where we were, and she said she was on her way. 3 minutes later, we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road toward us. We knew it was soon to be Bob's friend, but me and Bob thought maybe we could get a ride from a local. So we unloaded out of the car and stood in front of it and waited for the vehicle to stop. As the vehicle came into view, we saw it was an old beat-up pickup truck, and it slowed down to look at us, and inside I saw 2 heavily bearded men. And I looked at Bob, and he said what I was already thinking. That's the guys from the boat. The truck kept driving, and before I could respond, it turned around and drove toward us again. And the guys in the truck passed slowly by, staring at us as they went by. Bob called his friend back, told her to drive like hell and get here now. It took 5 minutes and we saw the headlights coming and we started to relax, thinking it was Bob's friend. But then his phone rang, and his friend called to tell him that she had taken a wrong turn and was going to be another 15 minutes. Bob hung up the phone and we watched in terror as the same truck slowly passed by us again, this time with only one of the boatmen in the truck. The driver slowed to a crawl and rolled his window down, and he spoke to us. "Looks like you fellers could use some help," he said, and then he sped up and drove off. The laughter started up again in the distance all around us, and over the next few minutes it got closer and closer. And in the distance, we saw 2 sets of headlights coming on and 2 vehicles coming toward us slowly, side by side, taking up the entire width of the road and coming our way. The laughter had intensified so much that it was like hundreds of children were laughing at us from close by. Our last shred of hope started fading away as those 2 vehicles got closer, but by a miracle, from the opposite direction on the road, we saw another set of headlights coming fast. Bob's friend pulled up next to us in a rush. She unlocked the doors and told us to get in, and right then 2 sets of headlights coming from the other direction turned off. She heard the laughing children and screamed at us to get in, and as soon as she started to drive away, the other 2 sets of headlights came on again, this time with their brights. As she sped away with us crammed into the car, the other 2 vehicles were on our tail, and they stayed on the bumper for the next mile, and then they turned onto a side road and disappeared. For the next 2 miles after that, we heard laughter still, way off in the distance. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened, and I hope somebody who hears this has had a similar experience and can share their story with me. To all of you who think the paranormal is just a fun hobby to get your thrills with, I warn you that we are not prepared for what is really out there. If you hear this story, I hope you sleep peacefully tonight. I, for one, know that for at least the next few nights, I won't be getting any sleep at all. Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. Man, that story that you just heard scared me to death while I was reading it. I could just see all of that happening. It was unbelievable. In this podcast, we have another paranormal, a haunting story. We have a story about a person who was actually attacked by an infamous serial killer. And then at the end, we've got a fantastic Bigfoot story. So I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you clicked on this video because you're not missing it. And I hope you enjoy it. All right, here we go. It was summertime, and the sun was beating down and the air was sweltering hot. And it was the kind of weather fit for relaxing in the shade with a good book or a dip in the pool, and that was about it. I chose to read a book. My book of choice was a magazine. It was one of those true detective publications. There was an article in it about how women can protect themselves in public or when someone is trying to harm them. I turned to the page and I began to read. It was full of information and tips, such as always being aware of those around you. For example, a woman should always glance behind her when entering a store at the mall. She should take stock of any man following her into the store or lurking outside the entrance. And if a man has followed her in, she should deliberately go to an area he wouldn't normally frequent. And if he continues to follow, she should leave the store and wait. If there's a bench available, she should sit down and observe without being too obvious. If he also sits or lingers, she should go to another store to see if he follows again. I firmly believe I was meant to read that article, but I had no idea until I decided to go into the mall later that day just how important the information would be. I had just bought a new dress that I was eager to wear, and it was too hot to stay outside. The mall was an air-conditioned oasis, so I bathed and I dressed and I did my hair and my makeup, and I was off for an afternoon of shopping. I entered the small dress shop and was warmly greeted by some of the employees. I was a frequent shopper and I was well known there. We spoke for a minute and they complimented me on how well I looked in this dress, and I went about my shopping. I had left that store and was heading for another when the article I read earlier came to mind. And casually, I strolled down the main corridor and I glanced around. Two women were engaged in a conversation near the entrance of the next store that I entered, and not far from them was a tall, nice-looking man wearing a sport coat and a tie and some nice slacks. He was well-groomed with neatly trimmed brown wavy hair. I didn't see anyone I considered to be a threat. I moved to the ladies' section to shop, as did the two other women, and so did the man. And I giggled to myself, wondering who the lucky lady was he was shopping for. He kept glancing at me. When I left the store, I couldn't help but notice that the man did too, and I continued down the mall, stopping to look in the window of a hobby shop. The man also approached the shop, and he stopped, seeming to amuse himself as well. I was immediately on guard, and as I continued through the mall, he followed. And when I stopped, he stopped. And when I moved on, he moved on. And I decided it was best to cut my trip short and leave the mall. I walked out the front door with the man right behind me, and I got my keys ready to open my car door. Now, back in the 1970s, key fobs weren't in existence. My green Gran Torino was parked halfway across the parking lot. It felt like miles away. And I finally entered the lane where it was parked, and the man entered the adjacent lane. I walked up beside my car, and he walked to the car parked directly in front of me, and he put his key into the lock as I inserted the key into mine. I opened my door, but he stepped away from his car, and he started walking toward me. I jumped inside my car just as he lunged for me, and he ran to my car door and grabbed the handle. And I hit the lock as he began to pull on it, and a split second later, he would have opened my door. It was a hot day, and cars can quickly turn into ovens on days like that. So to alleviate some of the heat, I left my window cracked about 2 inches, and he stuck his fingers through and began trying to force the window down. and I asked him what he was doing. "Open the door," he said over and over. I was so frightened that I panicked, and I turned the key and gassed the engine. The car wouldn't start. I had flooded it. Now I was fighting hysterics, and he continued to talk to me, saying awful things I can't repeat. And he asked me questions of a nature so shocking that I was stunned. And as he spoke, he worked himself into a frenzy, speaking faster and faster. Then he said he was doing this to me because it was what I wanted. All the while, I was honking the horn and yelling for help. It didn't deter him, though, in the least. He just kept telling me what he was going to do to me and that I wanted him to. A man and a woman walked behind the car, and I saw them and pleaded with them for help. They looked at the man and then at me, and they shook their heads in disgust, and they walked away. There were others in the parking lot, and many of them looked right at us, but it was like they didn't want to get involved. They all looked away and ignored the entire scene. I was trying to remain calm. I kept trying to crank the car. It was only me at that point. No one else was going to save me. And finally it started. I told him to back away because I was leaving, and he kept hold on the window and kept talking. "I'm warning you," I yelled. "If you don't remove your hand, it's going to roll up on your fingers, and I'm going to drive off with you attached to it." He didn't comply, so I followed through with my threat. I rolled up the window hard on his fingers and backed up. He still wouldn't let go. I drove to the main entrance of the mall with him still hanging onto the window, and I told him one last time to let go, and I punched the gas. He held on for a couple of steps, and his hands were wrenched from the window. As I drove off, I looked back, and he was straightening his tie and walking back inside the mall. This victory gave me courage, and I told myself he wasn't going to get away with what he did to me. I pulled over to the curb, and I went back inside the mall. At that time, they didn't have security like they do today, but they had a custodian, and he was a friend of my father's. And I found him and quickly told him the short version of what had happened. And together we went looking for the well-groomed man in a sport coat. We found him sitting in the back of a snack bar as if nothing had happened. And when I pointed him out, the custodian looked at me and said, "You must be mistaken. Look at that man. He looks like a lawyer or a businessman. He couldn't possibly be the one you're talking about." But when I insisted that he was indeed the man who had accosted me in the parking lot, I was told to go home and call my father. Meanwhile, the man was pretending not to notice us, but I knew he was watching, and I could feel his eyes on me, but what could I do? I was so upset that I left, but not without making sure that he wasn't following me. I will never forget his face. It was only inches from me for several minutes, and I stared right into his eyes. His image is forever etched in my mind. That night, when my husband got home from work, I told him the entire story, and his reply was to stay away from the mall. They were not words I wanted to hear. One night, as my husband and I were watching the news, I saw a familiar face. It was the man from the mall, and I screamed when I saw him. My husband, completely baffled by my response, demanded to know what was wrong with me, and I told him, but he said it couldn't be the same man. He was a serial killer from out west, and the news continued. It said that they had arrested a man in Florida where he'd been living and working, and his name was Ted Bundy. I lived only a few hours from where he was living. He easily could have stopped at the mall on the way to Florida or driven there on the prowl for his next victim. What he did to his victims was unspeakable. I once met a woman whose mother went out on a date with Ted Bundy. She worked at a mall in Birmingham, Alabama, and he'd asked her out several times and she had refused. And when he asked her why she wouldn't go out with him, she said, "For all I know, you could be a serial killer." "Well, do I look like a serial killer to you?" he would ask as he flashed her his charming smile. "What does a serial killer look like?" she asked. Eventually, she relented, and they had their date, and he picked her up at home and took her to a bar. She said the drinks he ordered for them weren't the usual beers that everyone seemed to be drinking and that they were out of the ordinary. Afterward, he took her home and he kissed her hand. "I like you," he said. "That's why I'm letting you go." Like me, the next time she saw him, he was on the news. And it goes to show you that monsters can come in pretty packages. Be aware of your surroundings and the possibility that someone could take you. Monsters come in all shapes and sizes and fur colors. Some are on 4 legs and some are on 2. And she signs the email, Lanita, survivor of a serial killer. Lanita is a friend of mine. She's told me this story before, and I've had this story for months, and I just haven't found this is the perfect podcast to put it in. So, Lanita, there is your experience with Ted Bundy. It scared me when you first told it, and it scared me right then when I just read it. You're a brave woman. I really appreciate you sending this to us. In 2013, on our way back home to Alabama, my mother and I stopped at the Myrtle Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana. It was one of those haunted tourist attractions. It was beautiful, but we never felt anything bad. The myrtles were in full bloom and Spanish moss hung around the massive oaks. The grounds were immaculately cut and trimmed. The brick courtyard was neatly cared for, with a big water fountain in the center with coins on the bottom where the guests had made their wishes. There was a really nice restaurant on the grounds, and we had a nice lunch. Afterward, we went on our tour of the house. It was just as beautiful inside as it was outside. We didn't feel uncomfortable at all, and since I'm normally sensitive about these things, we thought it being haunted was just a scam to get people to visit. We got home and I told my husband all about it, how beautiful it was, and all about the restaurant and how wonderful the food was. I told him it was not haunted and that I wanted to go back with him sometime and stay the night. Well, it took us 2 years, but we finally were able to make a reservation for a couple of nights. The time came and we headed to St. Francisville with the GPS leading the way. We arrived at 4 p.m. that day, and as my husband was parking the truck, I noticed a man walking from the woods to the driveway. He did not look right, and he was out of place. He had a big white flowing shirt on, he had tight black pants with knee boots on, and his hair was in a ponytail. And he glowed and shimmered, too. And I said to my husband, "Look, I think that's a ghost," but he was too busy parking to see. I got out of the truck, and as soon as I could, I walked after the man to see where he went. I couldn't find him, but I went to the place where he came out of the woods, and I found there was no path at all. The clearing he came out of had been a wild hedge of bushes. The whole area was nothing but thick shrubs. It was impossible for anybody to walk through. I realized then that I had seen a ghost during the day. Oh Lord, I thought, have I made a mistake about this place? We made our way to the gift shop, met up with a woman named Esther, and we got checked in. I told her about the man I saw, and she told me they would be interacting with me tonight. It was a creepy thing to say, I thought, but I thanked her, and we went on our way. The master bedroom was the only bedroom in the main house, and we had the house to ourselves with the only key. And right then, I felt something I hadn't felt on my first visit there with my mother 2 years earlier. There was a heaviness that I did not feel like before. Oh well, I thought, and I brushed it off. That night, we walked around for a while and decided to turn in. Going into that house that night had a different atmosphere than during the day. While we got in the bed with the lights out, we both fell asleep within minutes. But in the middle of the night, I woke up with the covers having been pulled off my shoulders. It was a little chilly, so I reached down and pulled the sheet back up, thinking that maybe my husband moved in his sleep and I was about to doze back off, and that's when I felt fingers on my shoulder pulling the sheet off of me. My husband had his back to me, and there was no way it could have been him. And I reached down and grabbed that sheet with my fist, and I pulled it over my head. I said an ugly word, and then I turned over and I rammed my face into my husband's back. I was so frightened I could hardly move, and I lay there for the longest time praying for the sun to come up. When it finally did, I begged my husband to come to the bathroom with me so that I wouldn't have to go alone. Despite the scary night, we had a great day taking pictures and venturing around this plantation. And while we were riding around, I told my husband what had happened to me during the night. That's when he told me he had his own tale to tell. In the night, somebody called his name right up against his ear, waking him up from a deep sleep. I looked right at my husband and I said, "How about we just go home?" But he shook his head no. We had already paid for another night. We were going to stay. I didn't want to go to bed that night, so we sat out in the courtyard until it was late. With me frightened to death about going in that house and climbing that staircase to our room, it was unbearable. But it was late and it was time to head in for the night. We got ready for bed, but this time we did it differently. We changed sides of the bed, and I kept the light on, and I prayed the whole night for our safety, and I eventually fell asleep. The last night was uneventful, thank you, Lord. We got our stuff and we headed home. On the way home, my husband told me he really liked that place and that maybe we could come back sometime. I told him he was nuts, and I was never going back to that place, and if he wanted to go, he'd have to go alone. Okay, let's end this podcast up with a Bigfoot story. Everybody likes the Bigfoot stories, so here we go. I come from a family of avid hunters. We camp and hike often and have for years, and I know the sounds normal animals make, as well as their tracks and scat. I lived outside Kalispell, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Kalispell, Montana, in an area called Many Lakes. I lived over the top, basically in the snow line. My kids and I lived in a quaint rental in a beautiful spot between 4 or 5 lakes. A couple of those lakes were private and others were public. My driveway was straight and I normally backed out onto the dirt as traffic was virtually non-existent. In April of 2016, I was up early, getting ready for work at 3:30 in the morning. I was almost finished when I decided to warm my Jeep up. When I stepped outside, I realized there was no noise. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. But it was so early in the morning that I didn't pay much attention. I made it to my Jeep, and as I reached my hand out to open the door, I heard the strangest deep growling howl noise that I had ever heard coming from the private lake. I stopped in my tracks and I realized something was running down my driveway to the game trail that goes to the lake. And as it ran, it let out an eerie call, answering the first one. The lake was slightly lit by the moon, and from where I stood, I could see the water ripple. It was almost as if the creatures had gone in the water. When they were almost to the other side of the lake, the first creature, which I assume was the larger of the two because its call was much deeper, called out again, and the smaller one answered. Well, I got goosebumps and my hair stood up, and I jumped in the Jeep and I started it and I ran back inside the house. I finished getting ready for work and I walked outside 15 minutes later. It was still eerily quiet. Even today, I can't remember ever hearing the woods being so quiet. I got into the safety of my Jeep and backed out onto the road. But the second my vehicle cleared the edge of the house, I was pelted with pine cones. Tons of them within a few seconds, and I stopped and rolled the window down and I yelled, "Knock it off!" I started to back up again, and as I hit the end of the driveway, they started throwing more pine cones, only this time not as many or as quickly. I knew what was throwing them, but I didn't want to believe it. I thought about it all day at work, and when I got off that afternoon, I went to pick my son up, Caden, from school. I told him about it, and he suggested that we go look for tracks. When we pulled up to turn into the driveway, he jumped out to get the mail like he usually did. He was about 4 steps from the mailbox when he froze and looked at me with huge eyes. He yelled for me to come look. And when I got out and ran over to him, I saw several running steps and then one left print that crossed over the right one, right where it stepped onto the game trail. My son started tracking it, and I got back in the car and parked the Jeep in the driveway. When I got out again, my son's face was lit up with excitement. He had found all kinds of tracks. We followed them down to the bank, and we saw the tracks go to the edge of the lake where they met up with a set of much larger tracks that were so big we could still see where they had stepped into the water. We filmed and we measured the tracks. The smaller ones were just over 13 inches, and the larger tracks were 17 3/4 inches. When we went out beside the house where the pine cones came from, we found a third set of tracks much smaller than the other two. It only measured 9 inches. In August of the same year, my husband and son were right outside my bedroom fixing my daughter's truck. They were both underneath it, and I went to take them some drinks. I stepped out of my bedroom door and instantly noticed a juvenile Bigfoot lying on top of the bank watching them. I didn't react, I just kept moving. I gave them the drinks, and Caden went inside for a minute, and when he was out of earshot, I asked my husband if he knew that there was a baby Bigfoot watching them. "Yeah," he said, "it's been there a while. It's not hurting anything. I think it's just curious." "Well, all right," I said, looking toward the house. "Does Caden know?" "Nope," my husband said. After 30 minutes, when Caden and my husband had finished and were getting ready to move the truck, Caden saw the Bigfoot, and he yelled and pointed excitedly, and then he ran after it. Well, that thing jumped up and moved so fast that it was down my driveway and across the road to the other lake before Caden had even got a few feet. It was the coolest thing. In December of 2020, I moved to Eureka, Montana, and bought a small ranch on a dead-end road that backed up to Canada. The 49th parallel was my northern fence line. The house had been vacant for 7 years, and when we moved in, we were pretty busy getting it ready to live in, and we didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. My son was now in the Air Force, and I saw him about twice a year. And in February, he and his wife visited for his birthday. We were all busy doing a lot with the horses and the house, and after a few days, when it was nearing dinner time and not yet dark, we were sitting in the living room chatting and waiting for dinner to be ready. Earlier that day, we had switched out my dryer for a new one, and we set the old one temporarily on the patio. The patio was concrete, and it was surrounded on 3 sides by the house. As we were sitting there, I noticed something big and black by the dryer, but all my dogs were inside and accounted for. And when I saw it, I stood up, and as I did, it stood up too. It was huge, and Caden saw it too. "That's a Bigfoot, Mom," he said quietly. I headed for the door to the patio with Caden behind me. That thing was every bit of 7.5 feet tall. Before it left, it stopped and looked at me, and I could see the whites of its eyes. It turned and stepped over the 42-inch high fence, and as I watched in amazement, Caden was already running through the living room to go out the front door. It was just getting dark out, and when Caden and I were both outside, we could see where the thing stepped on a pallet and broke it. The next step was 62 inches away. I could see it ran down the ravine, and I knew it was going to flank us so it could watch us more. I reassured my family that it was not going to hurt us, though. It was just curious. After all, no one had been at that house for years. I got on a local Facebook page and reported what I had seen, and a neighbor asked me to report it to the police. Well, I called and reported it, and within 15 minutes, we had 2 officers show up at the house. Well, we walked around with them, and they told us that they were going to check the barn and the outbuilding. It was dead quiet, and my horses were wide-eyed, and they were acting weird. After the officers checked the buildings and the neighbor's place, they came up to tell us that they hadn't seen anything. The younger officer told me he believed me and thought it was a Bigfoot, but the other officer, who was older and seemed to have no opinion, was on alert, and he was standoffish. We finally sat down to eat dinner, each of us amped up over all the excitement, and after we ate, I checked my Facebook and saw 200 replies to my post. most of them telling me the Bigfoots had been in that area for years. I also got a text from my neighbor, who was about 72 years old or so, and he told me the Bigfoots had been in the area for generations, that they come through several times a year and they move on. I also got a message from a guy who said he was a professional tracker. He asked if he could come around, and I told him, hell yes. He showed up that night after it had gotten really dark and cold outside, and he tracked it all the way down to the ravine and said it headed north and then west, but after a while, he lost the tracks. This guy told me he wasn't a Bigfoot believer, but he could verify that it was not a bear or a cat and was definitely not a wolf. He said it was bipedal and massive, but it walked soft-footed when not running. When he left, we all sat down and tried to settle in for the night, but the action was far from over. It was 10:45 and we heard a loud, flat-handed slap on the north side of the house next to my bedroom. Caden and I got up and went right outside, but we couldn't see any sign of anything. Later, we heard another slap, but tried to ignore it, and then it slapped again, harder than before, and dragged what sounded like claws down the side of the house. We decided it must have been juveniles messing with us, and again we tried to ignore it. I went to bed a little while later, only to be awakened at 3 a.m. by a horrible growl, unlike anything I had ever heard, right outside my window. I heard something jump up and down on the back of my avalanche truck, and then I heard branches breaking, and this went on for hours. Finally, at dawn, I got up the nerve to get up and finally go outside in my bathrobe, and I saw tons of tracks. I took pictures and videos of everything, and I measured everything I could. That afternoon, I contacted a well-known Bigfoot researcher, and he came all the way from California to my house, and he set up 2 gifting stations with food, toys, feathers, crystals, and buttons, all things he said that they loved. Over the course of the week that he stayed at the house, he was able to find out that we had a family of 5 Bigfoots in the area. The alpha male had an 18.5-inch track, which meant he was about 9 feet tall. We both agreed that they followed the elk, since they are a great source of food, and he told me that the slaps and scratches on the side of the house were most likely the young ones messing with us, just like we thought, and the growl that we had heard was the dad telling them to knock it off. While he was here, we had all kinds of Bigfoot signs, but unfortunately, we did not hear or see them at all. Since then, we have heard them a few more times, and we've seen signs of them, but never has one come right up to the house again that we know of. I was an active paranormal hunter for some time, and I love the thrill of the unknown. And I feel honored that they chose to let their presence be known to me. Wow, what a long time of experience with these creatures this person's had. It's a woman. She's talking about moving around, and everywhere they go, there just happens to be Bigfoot. So this was really interesting. Again, I'm one of these people I probably just live in a place where there aren't any Bigfoot. I never see a sign, I never see a track, I never see anything that would make me think a Bigfoot lives around here. But these people are in places where apparently they live, and they're not afraid of humans. And they're pretty conniving and pretty clever, to stay out of reach. And so anyway, the whole thing's just fascinating to me. But I love this story. And to the woman who sent it, I really appreciate it. It was well written and very concise and got right to the story. I thought it was wonderful. Thank you. Hey, thanks for listening to this podcast. I appreciate you listening all the way. If you can hear this message, you listened all the way. Man, weren't those spooky stories? I know they're not Bigfoot stories. Everybody loves the Bigfoot stories, but sometimes these other stories, man, they get to me. These were exceptional. So thank you to the writers, and thank you for listening, and we will see you guys on the next podcast. Thanks.